Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a bit of ground to cover. Let's jump into it. It's great to see you all. Thanks for being here. This session is intended as an opportunity to share some of the foundations of what we've learned over 2 days, 2 decades rather. Let's get the time scale right. Almost 2 decades of bringing futures to life. And it's in 3 sections, so just so we can pace ourselves. Where I'm coming from, then 3 dimensions of foresight, and then experiential futures in action. So where am I coming from? Well, as Rafael said at the start, I'm both an academic and a consulting futurist, and my focus has come to be, it didn't begin this way, but it has come to be on design, media, and arts-based interventions. When I say it didn't begin this way, I mean nobody was really doing this when my colleagues and I started doing it. Because in the 1990s, when I began, was, I would say, a much more staid, in a sense, and traditional kind of practice. And that still exists, but there is also, as we'll see, a kind of variegated landscape of other things going on that are more hybrid. These days, I work as a professor at Tec de Monterrey in, Mexico City. This is the Monterrey campus that is pictured. And we partner with a lot of different kinds of organization. I would say, especially since the pandemic. I don't know if this resonates with your experience as practitioners at all, but that in a way, the shared experience that we all had of undergoing this shock that shouldn't have been a complete shock, that is to say the onset and unfolding of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think made on our behalf, an argument that prior to that used to be a little bit harder to make. That is to say, the argument for paying attention to things, invest in those things in order to be better prepared. So currently, some of the things that I'm working on include training mayors from across the United States in foundations of foresight. We just did a session, this goes back to 2018, but over this past weekend, my colleague Jake Dunnigan and Ilana Lipset did a session with mayors from across the country at South by Southwest in Austin. We are currently working, me and my partner, Sita Verbakel, are working on experiential futures interventions for the World Energy Congress coming up in the Netherlands next month. I've been working on an ethnographic experiential futures project for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory for about 1.5 years on and off, and advising a New York Times initiative on efforts to make its journalism more rigorously futures-oriented. This initiative existed before our collaboration began, but if you're interested in it, look up New York Times Headway. And its editor, Matt Thompson. Very interesting thinking there. And lastly, another example, a public image published about 18 months ago almost now with the BBC and my lab, Situation Lab, working together, called The Futures Bazaar. And perhaps we'll get to more about that later. But this is a public access toolkit that anyone in the world can download and use to support foresight and public imagination through playful means with materiality wherever they may be. And before I became a professor, I served as an in-house futurist for a global engineering firm. And this is a company that is best known for projects like this, the Sydney Opera House, the Channel Tunnel, the Centre Pompidou, all these buildings in London with nicknames like the Gherkin and the Shard and the Walkie-Talkie. It's a company called Arup, it's employee owned, it has a footprint around the world, and these are the kinds of projects it's best known for. But I'd say one of the major lessons that experience working within Arup as a futurist for 3 years did for me was to pull focus on this idea that when you're designing anything at all, you're kind of creating a fragment of the future. And that might be especially obvious when it comes to large buildings and infrastructure, because they last for decades or generations after the ribbon is cut. But I also found that many of the same challenges exist in that context as are encountered in government. And so in my experience, sometimes people make perhaps a little too much of the difference between, oh, well, we're in government, or oh, we're at a multilateral institution. It's not the same thing. And it isn't the same thing, but it's similar enough that I find that the lessons port or travel across from one context to another. Now, I've been involved in the futures field since the 1990s, and I started out my studies and my work life in the realm of law and policy. And so I'm emphasizing that because I think also another kind of perhaps unconsciously defensive assumption that people make is, well, that person's a designer or they do art. But we change side organizations. And I'm telling you this because my training is not in design. It is not in art. I began in working for the British government and the Australian government in foresight and foresight adjacent processes. And it was really out of those experiences that, in a sense, we could be doing this better, more innovatively, more impactfully, and more creatively. That's where these practices came from. So I'm putting that to you kind of as a little bit of background, but also as perhaps a challenge if you're thinking, well, how does this relate to us? I believe that it must. So I won't say too much about the futures or foresight field because I think people here are plenty familiar with it, but I do want to just note, kind of to cast a gaze back into history a little bit, that it goes back further than a lot of people, even practitioners, even trained practitioners, might realize. And the first person, to my knowledge, to call for an actual profession of foresight and for a professor of foresight, of which there are now plenty, but at the time there were zero, was this man, H.G. Wells, Herbert George Wells, on BBC Radio in 1932, who said, and you can find this, a transcript of this online. This is 92 years ago. He said, all these new things, these new inventions and new powers come crowding along. Every one is fraught with consequences. And yet it is only after something has hit us hard that we set about dealing with it. And of course, Wells is best known for his storytelling, for being one of the founding figures of speculative fiction, or science fiction, if you prefer. And those stories are still being turned into movies and TV shows. But Wells was also a public intellectual whose argument, a key argument to the British public of his day was that we need to take these things seriously as a society, not just entertain ourselves, but prepare ourselves for possible futures. So science fiction for serious futures purposes, happily reinventing this as if it's a new idea to use science fiction to think about actual change in society, but it's actually baked into the prehistory of the field of foresight itself. So that's perhaps something worth knowing, that in a way we have, it's possible that we've in a way lost touch or could do well to regain touch with the fused history or the joint history of those two sets of practices, one more organizational in character and the other more cultural. Now, the critical and humanistic tradition of futures practice that I most identify with, that my master's and PhD are in, and that I've spent most of my time working in, that tradition revolves around having robust and shared and recognizing the catalytic power of images of the future, the ideas about the future that we carry around. I mean, I don't care whether you're a scientist or a mathematician, the ideas about the future, stories that you tell yourself is most likely, about what's going to change, about what's most valuable. These inform the choices that people make in their lives, about how they get educated, about where they live, about what kind of work they might do, as well as the collective decisions that we make in government and public contexts. Another person to mention in relation to that, this kind of constellation of influences is the great Elise Boulding, one of the founding figures, not just of futures studies, but of peace studies, a Quaker, a feminist historian. And Elise Boulding said, we cannot achieve what we cannot imagine. So this idea of investing in futures, not just from a strictly instrumental decision-making standpoint, but from the standpoint of investing in imagination in order to disclose new possibilities. And actually my favorite, I won't say definition, but characterization of the field comes from the Indian political psychologist and public intellectual in a wonderful article. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's called Bearing Witness to the Future from 1996. For me, futures studies are basically a game of dissenting visions. A game of dissenting visions. They're an attempt to widen human choices. And so this idea of asking what else could be true other than the predominating ideas about the future that might be circulating at any given time, and there are always some kind of key ideas that hold sway at any given moment, but what else might turn out to be true? We need to invest in a diversity of ways of thinking. So every human being has and uses some foresight capacity. This isn't just a special field, or for ivory tower or for privileged people in the halls of power. It's a human capacity that every single human being has, and what strategic foresight and its particular applications entail in a government context, organizational context, are a kind of amplification or augmentation of something that we all do all the time anyway. All right, so much for part one. On to part two, 3 dimensions of foresight. So I kind of put this to you as an offering that I think there are basically 3 different facets of thought, or 3 different kinds of stretch. You can almost think of them as like 3 yogic stretches in our capacity to foresee. And those would be difference, diversity, and depth. So difference, to kind of visualize it, difference, diversity, and depth. Difference would refer to how is the world changing and where might that lead? This, in a sense, is like the most basic question when it comes to thinking about the future. Diversity, what are the different ways that an unpredictable system could evolve? This might be the most basic question when it comes to pluralizing futures with an S. And depth, what would it mean and how might it feel to be in particular future circumstances? And this might be the most basic question of stepping outside of a purely intellectual approach to these other 2 questions. So I'll say a little bit more about each, and then in the third part show what I think it can look like to lean into a fully kind of 3-dimensional practice of foresight. So the first dimension, difference. The future is another place. The most basic and omnipresent element of future thinking concerns how the future context is not the same as the present one. This is almost a definition of time, right? All thinking about the future begins from this basic point. The essential feature of time is that now is not equivalent to later. But what is the difference? What are the differences between now and later that we need to be thinking about, or could valuably invest in thinking about at this point? So whether you are wondering, worrying, or telling stories about the world or the future might bring, whether you are scanning and paying attention to trends or emerging issues, whether you are thinking about implications, like something like a futures wheel, whether you are taking any kind of action to adapt, all of these activities are in a sense, and frameworks like this STEEP and its variants, or emerging issue analysis and the innovation diffusion curve, or the pace layering approach of the Long Now Foundation. There's a whole bunch of ideas that are basically sort of the most foundational ones, I think, in futures thinking that have to do, and even the concept of the image of the future, try to grapple with this first and most basic dimension of difference. Any given attempt to envision or predict any image of the future embeds a notion of difference. Even a conservative, small c conservative preferred future in which things stay as they have been, as Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa said in The Leopard, if we want, or one of the characters does, if we want everything to remain as it is, it will be necessary for everything to change. So even in a kind of conservative steady state notion of a future, if you are on a moving train, something has to change in order for that train to stay where you would like it to be. So the takeaway from this first dimension is it's important to ask how the future context might be different from the present, and to make a habit of tracking change in different aspects of the system. And I assume that anyone who does any kind of futures work is probably doing some version of that. But sooner or later, you realize that trends and emerging issues actually point in different directions. They don't just have a unitary kind of, and here's the future served up on a platter. You realize that a laundry list of changes does not a coherent theory of change make. It's not synthesized into a, what does that mean for how the world's going to look? And you realize that extrapolation, or any kind of what I would call monofuturism, is not enough, is not equal to the challenge of dealing with the yet to be. So this brings us to the second dimension, which is diversity. Now, diversity is this recognition that the future is always multiple potentials, not just one. That's why difference by itself isn't enough. We know that the future will be different from the present now, but we also need to recognize from the present in a bunch of different ways. So, which is why you have all these kind of cone-shaped visualizations of, looking from the present. So instead of this, a kind of linear trying to figure out what the future is going to be, or this kind of blooming, buzzing confusion of, I don't know, there's too many variables, can't possibly say, or this, a kind of reaching for an idea about the future and finding that the cupboard is bare. The future maybe starts to look, diagrammatically anyway, a little bit more like a horizon of plural possibilities, a landscape of branching paths that we can try to explore more systematically in terms of what it contains and what it means. So pluralizing futures, adding that S, is the beginning of working more systematically with uncertainty and with the experience of uncertainty. Our futures practice is filled with generative processes and frameworks for exactly this kind of purpose. So, these cone diagrams and this is a snapshot of an evolving picture of the Brexit crisis as that was unfolding in the years after 2016. What were the various breakpoints or dividing points in the possibility space as mapped by this blogger, John Worth? Or the Montfleur scenarios for South Africa as transitioning from apartheid to democracy, or the infamous 2x2 scenario process, which is kind of, I think, probably still the most widely used, but certainly very far from the only way to generate alternative scenarios, or causal layered analysis, or generic images of the future, or you name it, really. These are all just different ways of, as the proto-futurist Dutch sociologist Fred Pollack put it, different ways of drawing boundaries in the thought realm. We have this kind of landscape of possibilities, and we carve it up into different kinds of world, different kinds of circumstance that we could find ourselves in. Or as Nishnan says, we can see ourselves as playing this game of dissenting visions, widening human choices by understanding the range of things that could occur. And this notion of diversity can be seen in a bunch of practices and concepts from within the field. So the takeaway here is that it's an important investment in resilience to map a range of futures on an ongoing basis to keep up with change. And all these diagrams that I've just showed and sort of frameworks, these intellectual prostheses, these intellectual tools for carving up realm, they can be very important and valuable work. And they can be the beginning of very significant insights into what needs to change in our companies, our communities, our countries. But sooner or later, you realize the work is not about what's in the reports or the documents or the scenarios. It's about what actually changes in the minds of your audience or your constituency or your ministers. So they make different decisions because their minds have been changed. You realize sooner or later that simply raising and describing possibilities at an abstract level and in text often isn't enough to actually make that change happen. And this brings us to the third dimension of foresight, which is depth. Any future that we get will be as real and complex as the present is. And so how can we breathe dimensionality or recognize the dimensionality that is there within those possibilities? The thing is, we use, as human beings, we use our experiences from the past to navigate change. So when neuroscientists look at a brain imagining past events, or that same brain trying to imagine future events, the same parts of the brain, for the most part, are lighting up because in a way we are drawing on our fund of memory and experience in order to concoct ideas about what events could be. And in that sense, our notions of what the future are circumscribed by our limited experiences. Now, I want to be clear that our experiences include the things we have read, the movies that we watch, the Netflix series that we consume, or the anime, or whatever it may be. Those are also experiences. But how might we counteract the tendency to discount futures, especially in serious contexts, like the ones that I presume many of you work in, and this tendency to discount futures, especially those that differ in important ways from what we have experienced ourselves. Now, my own training at university, I mentioned that I came across futures in high school, but my training at university, there wasn't a futures program for undergrad, was pretty dry. I did history and philosophy of science, I did law, and then I started my career in government or futures and futures adjacent work. And I gradually came to realize that even when I saw people doing very good work, good, responsible, rigorous futures work, when it comes to the most significant governance issues that we confront collectively, we're usually barely even trying to grapple with the question of what the futures in question could be like to experience. We're staying generally in this kind of register of logic, of sort of scenario logic and facts and figures alone. And you can see this issue actually with one of the most important challenges confronted by the human species, climate disruption. If you look at the summaries for policymakers that the IPCC has put out, and I'm not here to knock the IPCC, please, let's be clear about that. I want to note that science will take us only so far and no further. This is from the 2000 edition of the Special Emissions Report. This is from the 2018 1.5 degree report, slightly nicer data viz, but still very high abstraction characterizations of these worlds that differ wildly. We're talking about the difference between a world that billions of people can comfortably live in and one in which they can't. And yet that's nowhere sort of discernible in the diagrams and the high level descriptions. The most recent edition, the 2023, or about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, the synthesis report for the sixth, for AR6, is again a little bit more sophisticated from a data viz standpoint, but still this is very high abstraction. And the reason for that is because good, responsible science prohibits them telling us what it would be like on the ground for people living in these various futures. That is not a scientific question. But meanwhile, what's at stake, the kinds of actual experiences of people, and these are images from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which happened about 3 weeks after I went to Hawaii for grad school in the Futures program there. The experiences of people on the ground, the full-blooded, life experiences are nowhere present in these high-level evocations of the future in the reports. So somebody needs, and it isn't climatologists, it isn't necessarily policymakers, but somebody needs to try to make thinking about the future an emotional experience, not just a cognitive one. And this is where our first experiments with bringing futures to life came from. Not that specific example, but from this problem. And this is what I mean by depth, this third dimension, trying to understand the contours and implications of alternative futures more than just cognitively or intellectually. And there's a bunch of ways of doing this. What we want to do is, instead of consider changes in the abstract at a high level, how do we get under the skin of them? And so that can look like immersing people in physical experiences of possible futures. It can look like providing, postcards from altered futures. They don't be evocative of the experience of inhabiting a future. It can look like artifacts or products from the future. It can look like guerrilla experiences of a particular place overlaid on that place as if the future were happening now. These are all examples from the first few years of futures work that that my colleagues, particularly Jake Dunnigan, who's now at Institute for the Future, and I, that we did in Hawaii and beyond. And so experiential futures is the whole design space, if you like, of stuff, which would include, what some of our colleagues now call design fiction or speculative and critical design, and situations that you can inhabit, that you can interact with. So immersive scenarios, role-playing, simulation. And so experiential futures is the design of situations and stuff from the future to catalyze insight and change. And the takeaway at this of this third dimension is that we must try not just to think, so to feel our way into these future conditions if we're going to grapple with them effectively. So to recap those three dimensions, our images of the future should aim to be: 1, different from the world we know or are accustomed to thinking about; 2, diverse, different from each other, representative of a wide range of actual perspectives, which is also an argument for extreme inclusivity when it comes to formulating those ideas about futures, and reflective of the actual breadth of possibilities. And then deep, meaning they probe beyond the obvious. They have complexity and nuance, and ultimately they affect us emotionally, not just from the neck up. And you can see how each of these three dimensions names something vital in our foresight capacity, because it lets us see how the IPCC's climate report work is exceptionally strong on difference. I mean, it describes what kinds of things we can expect in the various futures they outline, and diversity, because there really is a wide variety of climate outcomes described in that work, but it's not as in depth. And somebody needs to pick up the baton where they leave it. This also lets us see how movies set in one future or another may have terrific depth. They may be very emotionally transportive, but they might lack certain kinds of diversity. And I'm not just talking about the cast of those movies, although that may also be true. I'm talking about the kinds of futures that are actually on offer and available to the public mind. And this trio of dimensions might also help us appreciate, hey, say, our company or our government agencies. Trend work might do a really excellent job of recognizing difference, but lack rigor in diversity and sort of synthesizing into alternative sense-making positions, or the depth of the futures under discussion. So this third dimension is typically underdeveloped, in my experience, in governments and organizational contexts, although this is changing very quickly, has been for the last 5 or 10 years. And the best approach to adopt is whatever it takes. And I have a bunch of examples of what this can look like, but I also want us to get into Q&A. Maybe what I'll do is just flash through some of these over the next couple of minutes so you can see what I'm talking about, and then we can transition into conversation. So, you know, it can look like creating hypothetical products as if they were real, as a basis for discussion about, you know, well, what would it mean if this thing came to market and existed in our lives? It can look like, this is one of the few examples of work I've done for an arts, for an art museum context, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, Belgium. And you can sort of see from this variety, this is a collaborative project we did for the California Academy of Sciences to bring this statistical increase, exponential increase of plastic in the biosphere into a dilemma for the body. So it's not just a statistic anymore, it's an understanding of what we're doing through plastic to the world that we live in. Or this project, which I alluded to briefly before, which is about creating, based on interviews with people who lived and worked in Chinatown, Honolulu, experiences of those futures brought to life in that neighborhood. Or this project, which is funded by the CDC and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and commissioned by the State Department of Health. It was an alternate reality game about pandemic preparedness, which we did back in 2009. Fun fact about that, there had not been a pandemic for 40 years. Then a month before we launched this game, Coral Cross, there was a pandemic for the first time in 40 years. So we had to retool the game. And so what you're seeing here, and I won't explain these, but what you're seeing here is the variety of ways in which futures can be brought to life, visually, orally. I mean, you can't see that in these cases, but in an example like Hawaii 2050, we created soundscapes for people to inhabit, in addition to immersive environments. These objects that we created for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies for their biennial statutory meetings back in 2017. All of these were created by the in-house team themselves, one of their first efforts to produce artifacts from the future. Business cards from their organization's own future, featuring jobs descriptions that did not exist yet. And so I'll leave it there and just say the title of this presentation, Whatever It Takes, comes from the information designer Edward Tufte, editor of the author of Beautiful Evidence and various other really beautifully crafted books about communicating information visually. And his mantra, way to communicate information visually, is whatever it takes. And I think that we can adopt that and extend it as part of our practice as futurists and in-house strategists, innovation people, however you identify yourself. Whatever it is that needs to be done in order to have ideas about the future land with people, haunt their dreams, and change how they think and feel and decide, that's what you should do. That's what we should be doing. And the ultimate reason for this is not just to do a good job. I mean, that's important. But more important still is the need for a collective, that is to say, species-wide capacity for foresight and the habit of thinking ahead. We're not going to succeed in inculcating that habit if it requires everybody going to grad school and learning the geeky terminology. We need cultural practices that embed these issues. So I hope that you find yourself provoked or in somehow spinning on what kind of possibilities this might disclose for your context. And I very much look forward to a conversation about those possibilities. Thanks very much for your attention.